Okay, thanks, Simon. There was a slightly deliberately provocative title to this talk. I'll probably only talk for about 10 minutes, and then we'll have a little bit more chance for a discursive discussion. But I wanted to frame this in a way as a sort of challenge to kick off day 2, to re-energize us again and to get us focused on the task in hand, and actually just talk through some of the work that Futera's done over the last few years, which I think is really relevant for the type of storytelling and insights we're trying to glean. So let's kick off, if we may, with a very short film which we made for the World Conservation Union as part of our Love Not Loss work for them. So if we can cue VT.
What's that? I said I'm a conservationist. Oh, everybody likes talking, don't they? No, a conservationist, like an environmentalist. Oh, I'm a bit crazy too, do you know what I mean? Woo! No, environmentalist. What?
Struggling to get your voice heard? Communicate better with Love Not Loss.
We did about 10 of these, brilliantly voiced by Alistair McGowan for the World Conservation Union Congress last year as part of this Love Not Loss campaign. And the reason I sort of stuck that in there is because it kind of ties into the point I was making at the end of yesterday. It's like when people say in a focus group, I'm not an environmentalist, but. And that's the bridge we're trying to get over, as Simon so eloquently said, when we're trying to rewrite a story for 9 billion people. And one of the mantras which has driven so much of Futera's work over the last 13 years is this idea that if we want to subvert the dominant paradigm, we have to have more fun than they are and let them know while we're doing it. That's the way that we become irresistibly attractive to the broader, wider mainstream. And a lot of the talk yesterday was also about this march of progress. You know, when we talked about the big stories and the little stories, it can feel that this march of progress is the big story, that it's always going in one direction, that this is inevitable pursuit of techno-progress. And I like the Future Bristol visions that came up yesterday, the sort of business-as-usual techno-utopianism versus perhaps a softer, you know, more community-focused, people and nature-focused type of idealism. And really, progress is not linear. Actually, progress can create progress traps. We like to think that it's incremental, that it always goes in one direction, but anyone with a kind of knowledge of even human cultural history, who's read books like Jared Diamond's Collapse, knows that it peaks and troughs, it ebbs and flows, it goes backwards if you take your eye on the ball, off the ball. And you know, when we see some of the challenges we face now, like climate change, our pursuit of cheap, abundant, available energy is creating a progress trap, because it's that cheap, abundant, available energy in the form of fossil fuels which is creating the carbon dioxide and the climate change, which is actually undermining our potential for future progress. So progress traps are a big issue, and I would argue that's a false big story that we're being sold at the moment, and actually there are little stories, as Nathan Oxley said yesterday, that can undermine it. The other point I need to remind ourselves of, and I touched on it in my framing of the whole conference yesterday morning, is that the hero myth, the mono myth, which is present in all human cultures around the world, has been undermined in the last sort of 50 years by the kind of the forces of advertising, communication, and marketing. And what we're really trying to recapture, if you like, is this hero myth. This idea of higher values, the idea of an adventure, the idea of a triumphant return, having gone through a period of difficulty and learning, where we come back with insights and wisdom which allow us to live better on our one and only lonely planet. And if you look at these in terms of stories, and I think there were threads of these in the workshops we did yesterday as well, it's like there are 4 fundamental needs that we have in the stories we tell ourselves. They're usually something around physical health and safety, you know, that fundamental basics of physiological well-being. There are these ideas of love and belonging, of being part of something bigger than just ourselves. Having this desire and ability to self-determine is very important, this independence and autonomy. And finally, and perhaps the most interesting one for us, is this potential for hope and change, that we can do things better, that we can learn from our mistakes, that we can be smarter. And this is why I want to sort of use a few examples to try and bring some of these ideas to life, because about 3.5 years ago, we were commissioned to do by the Convention on Biological Diversity to do the logo and branding and core messaging of the International Year of Biodiversity. And this is where the Velociraptor bit comes in, because this is an example of both sort of a challenge of getting something through against a sort of death by committee type process, and also wrestling with what might be an impossible creative brief. So someone says, well, we just need a logo, you know, which encapsulates the entire diversity of life on Earth. And it can be replicable in black and white and at this scale at the bottom of the right-hand corner of a piece of paper. And then when we started to come together trying to bring all these different elements in, we had people saying your fish look like flying bombs, your wave is breaking in a hydrographically incorrect fashion. The flamingo looks like a velociraptor. Why has it only got one leg? Should it have two legs? You know, your human beings are not culturally neutral enough. You know, are they gender neutral enough? Are they representative? You know, are they male or female? You've got a tree. Why haven't you got a food crop? You know, should we have an ear of corn? Well, maybe half the world eats rice. Where's your pollinator? You know, it's almost impossible to please all the people all the time. And you know, we went through these wranglings, and the only way we got this through was by effectively standing our ground and saying, look, this is an impossible task you're trying to do. This is a great encapsulation, and it's something very simple. And you know, we got it through. It's probably the biggest, highest profile campaign I'll ever get to work on in my life, probably. It appeared, used by 1,500 organisations around the world, practically every country on the planet, bar North Korea. And you know, on various different kind of grandstanding political platforms. What was amazing about it was when it appeared in places like this, on the side of an Airbus A380, which for those of you who know my no-flying lifestyle was a particular point of irony for me, seeing it slapped on the side of a massive jet. And it's since evolved into the decade on biodiversity, where finally we got the pollinator in and managed to address some of people's other concerns. But coming out of this work, because we'd been doing conservation principles work before that, came this publication, Branding Biodiversity, which hopefully everyone in the room has seen. And this was about, it was deliberately sort of provocative in terms of titling, but it was about learning from what the mainstream can do well and adjusting it to make it relevant to our particular communications challenges. And without going into massive detail here, what we were trying to get people to do was to rebalance the message, saying, you know, don't emphasize the loss the whole time. We need more love. Love is the heart, literally the core of our effective messaging, about reigniting that love and that connection with nature. You know, love literally does conquer all when we get it right. And also not getting obsessed with the the value of ecosystem services. That's an important message, but it doesn't work very well with the public. As I always say, you know, people say, I love my sister, I love my dog. But if you say to them, how much is your dog worth, you know, or how much is your sister worth, it's quite difficult to put a financial value on that, and actually probably questions the relationship you have with them. And add some action, gives people something tangible, something they can actually do. And so we've been trying to apply this and these principles in all the work that we've done, and sometimes to greater or lesser effect. This is an example of what happens when the committee wins. And this is we were invited to do a rebrand for BirdLife International, which got right to the very end of the process and then got shelved. And I think it's a real shame, because I think the identity and the positioning we came up with was really quite beautiful. And certainly a progression. I'm not saying there's anything fundamentally wrong with the existing logo, but we were trying to bring in an additional creative, colourful dynamism to what is an amazing, overarching and inclusive suite of organisations doing great work around the world. So unfortunately, this is still shelved in some kind of virtual digital file somewhere. Where we did get to do it was when we work with smaller organisations who can see the potential value that this type of repositioning can bring to their work. So this is work we did with the Sundarbans in Bangladesh with the Bangladesh Wildlife Trust. And they wanted to reposition themselves, partly to get better international funding, but partly to change the way they were perceived, because there's all sorts of challenges with NGO activity in parts of the world like Bangladesh. So we created this idea of Wild Team to make it really dynamic and beautiful and colourful and give them an international profile beyond their small localised region. And we started with a tiger project, and what we were trying to do was, really give it some verve and some passion, and to represent the great work they were doing on the ground. And we then have helped them launch a kind of wild rickshaw challenge, a fundraising challenge, people riding rickshaws across Bangladesh, and helping them to position their work in a way that is centered around people, is fearless, bold and brave, that actually is addressing real challenges. And again, has this air of celebration about it. And the work that they do in Bangladesh is amazing. And if you have a look at their website, you can see all the fantastic stuff they do on the ground in the Sundarbans region. Perhaps on the other side, it's all very well working with the small campaigners, but we've also worked with some big clients where you might think, well, what the hell has the rainforest got to do with Sky? Which was exactly the question we asked ourselves when the brief arrived in the inbox. Going, well, can we do something clever with this? Can we change the positioning and actually raise some decent funds for rainforest conservation? Because quite rightly, when Sky first launched Rainforest Rescue, most of their customers went, why is my satellite box trying to get me to do conservation work? And what we did was we flipped the campaign around and changed it into getting people to have an emotional connection with the Amazon, to try and get them to feel that they had some autonomy, that they had some connection with the Amazon. We turned it into I Love the Amazon rather than Rainforest Rescue. And you might have seen this, there's a Twibbon, there was all sorts of activity going on around it. Sky have thrown lots of programming behind it, and the partnership with WWF is all about saving 1 billion trees and raising £2 million for rainforest conservation. So it's a different positioning, but it's a way of using existing channels and getting people who might not be conventionally connected away from the usual suspects, not just preaching to the choir, but getting people into doing something connected with conservation. On a more grassroots level, who's worked with RARE or heard of RARE International? So these guys are amazing in terms of empowering and informing and providing tools to small grassroots conservation campaigns around the world. They have literally thousands of projects. And we work with them on honing their theory of change. And this is a kind of classic thing about how do you share insight in the best way and in the most brief and concise way possible. So we help them rewrite the whole guide. They have a very specific process, their theory of change they take people through. The brief initially arrived and the report was 10,000 words long. So I wrote them a brief saying, right, the first challenge is to get this to 2,500 words, and showed them how they could do it. And then we redesigned it. And what this is great is it takes people on a step-by-step process. All of the insights and the kind of things that you guys have been talking about over the last 36 hours are encapsulated in this theory of change, which allows anyone to pick up their community conservation guide and develop a community conservation plan. So it's a really useful one. Again, it's all freely downloadable if you're interested in that kind of work. I thought I'd throw in a couple of projects from our Swedish team because we have offices in New York and Stockholm. Our Swedish team did a great campaign around the Marine Stewardship Council in Sweden, which made it into the most asked for ethical trade label in Sweden. And we used this notion of the blue fish, the shoaling fish, of people coming together to demonstrate a mass movement and a mass demand for ethical, sustainable seafood. And my favourite one, which is one that our Swedish team did for the Swedish Soil Association, KRAV, where they're basically running an in-store campaign saying spread cow dung and bird song every time you shop. Because if you're buying Soil Association accredited work, that's essentially what you're doing. So before we kind of open it up for questions and clarifications, I would say we've launched a new thing, which is again maybe useful for framing some of your kind of campaigns. These freely downloadable changemaker cards, which are 13 different ways you can use to engage people. And these can be applied to products, brands. We've even done it. My flatmate in London works for Sutton Community Farm, and we used these techniques to try and improve the uptake of their veg bag scheme. And came up with all sorts of novel ideas of how to increase the effectiveness of the promotion of that particular product. And I'll finish with a picture of this man, because I think what's happened in the last week and a half, I think, is symptomatic of the point I was trying to make yesterday morning, in the fact that a lot of the big stories and a lot of the established stories we're told are unraveling. Now, I'm not saying Russell Brand's the answer. You know, he's obviously not, although his subsequent article in The Guardian on Tuesday is suitably caveated from the points he was making in a slightly more free-form way on Newsnight the night before. But this video of his appearance has been watched nearly 10 million times now, in a week and a half. Now, I think we'd dream of that type of connection. We would love it if 10 million people were engaging with our campaigns in those sort of short periods of time. And I think in the context of the zeitgeist, what Russell was saying has clearly resonated with a lot of people, because people are saying, that's a story that I connect to. That's not a story I hear. That's not an argument I hear. I totally disagree with him on not voting. But what he's saying now is actually our democracy deserves more. And the thing is, people deserve better campaigns from us. Campaigns which connect to them, which are relevant to their lives, but also celebrate this love and connection and the bigger picture. And I love Simon's intro because I don't know if you've seen, there's a short film out at the moment, which again is one of these ones which went totally viral, actually made by a guy from Bristol called Overview. Has anyone seen Overview? Again, Google it, it's a fantastic movie. I would have shown the whole thing here. It's only about 20 minutes long. But what Overview does is tells the story of what happens to astronauts when they go up into orbit for the first time. And the guy who made it is a bloke called Guy Reed. He went to the States and he interviewed former astronauts. And the Overview effect is a documented psychological effect which says that when they see the vulnerability and fragility of the planet from orbit, they tend to have this incredible epiphany. I mean, we all go, duh, obviously. You know, we've been talking about, you know, the blue marble and the view from space. But these guys and gals tend to be very hard-bitten former military test pilots. You know, they're not exactly hippie, happy, clappy types. And they have these profound revelations about our role and our role on the planet. And Guy is now working on a film which actually taps into exactly the point that Simon was making, which is called Continuum, which is basically saying that if you're alive here and now today, you can trace your ancestry right back to the Big Bang and the dawn of time. That's quite a big responsibility, which we are sort of obliged to be living up to a bit more. It's a bit like when Bob Bloomfield said yesterday, when we asked the question, how did you get here? Well, that's a long story. It takes about 4.5 billion years to tell it. And that's where we find ourselves right now. So I am a great believer in passionate hope. I'm a great believer in the potential for change, and I think the darkest hour always comes before the dawn, and that's why we should be optimistic about where we're going next. And I will leave you with one more film before we do questions.
Diane,
Yes, my darling.
Dan, I wanted to ask you something. Something that is important to both of us.
Oh, sweetheart.
Yeah, I was hoping that you'd do me the honour of...
Oh, my God. I thought you'd never ask. I do.
I'm signing this land protection petition.
Signing a what? The
The
what?
land protection petition.
What's a petition?
It's a petition.
Struggling to get the right message heard? Communicate better with Love Not Loss.
Brilliant. Thank you very much.